Trust has a job. Sometimes people do not do their job. God says trust, tawakkul, has two branches. One branch is you, the second branch is me. You do your job and I will do my job. I will take care of you. But you have to begin the journey. If you are
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Merciful, the Compassionate. All praises to Allah, the Creator of the universe and its Sustainer, the Provider of believers and non-believers. And may His choicest blessings be on the seal of His prophets, the last of His messengers and His holy progeny. And in particular, during these days of Muharram, may His incessant blessings ever continue on that illustrious grandson of the Holy Prophet, on Abu Abdullah al-Husayn, salawatullahi alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we continue with our discussions looking at mental health lessons from the history of Karbala. We have been examining the speeches, the teachings, the actions of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and his illustrious companions and family members, and correlating them with what we see from the psychotherapeutic techniques that are advocated for dealing with mental health challenges such as depression and anxiety. Our discussion today will inshallah be about anxiety and how we may learn from the history of Karbala about managing anxiety, and what we see from the scientific literature about some of the aspects of how it might work. Of course, each individual is different and we need to respect those individual differences. But there are nevertheless certain common features that we see in experiences of anxiety that we can draw upon to try and help those experiencing anxiety and help ourselves when we are in the midst of such an episode. And of course, we see from Surah Al-Maryam eminent prophets like Zakaria alayhi salam, where it says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, wa inni khiftul mawaliya min warai, where he says that I am anxious, I am concerned about what will happen to my community after me. Because of course, at that time, he didn't have an heir to continue his work. And the important thing is that not only was he open in his discussion with his loving Lord, he opened his heart and shared with God the anxiety he was experiencing. But unlike a lot of what we hear today, Zakaria alayhi salam did not take the view that the experience of anxiety is somehow a symptom of poor faith. Quite the opposite. In fact, it was because of his concern about the continuity of the faith that he was anxious, because the people that he saw in the community did not inspire him with confidence, and he didn't have anyone who he could leave his work to continue that work. And so we learn two things from Zakaria alayhi salam. One, the acknowledgement of how we feel openly in a transparent way, both acknowledging to oneself as well as declaring it to others. In this case, he was sharing it in a private conversation with God. And secondly, he shows how to use one's faith to support ourselves during such times, never losing hope in the salvation that Allah can offer. And this is quite an important challenge that we face nowadays, because all too often we live in an era of immediacy. And partly what that means is that not only does the world expect us to deliver things faster and at a sort of frenetic pace, particularly with the pressures of social media. There is an imperative, even through emails, to respond to things quickly. This pace of life has been turned up a few notches, and that has an effect on our overall stress levels. The scientific data shows that a small amount of stress, a basic level of stress, is a good thing. It activates us, it forces us to galvanize our resources. But it's not a question of avoiding stress in our lives. Stress is an integral part of life. Indeed, we experience stress when we're actually doing something, particularly when we're moving outside of our comfort zone. That's not the issue. The issue is distress, not stress. The issue is the mismanagement of stress and how that can then reach a point where we experience the kind of anxiety that becomes debilitating. And one of the things that we learn from Zakaria alayhi salam is how to use our trust in Allah to stop that anxiety becoming debilitating, but to enable us to continue going. Because he says very clearly that never have I found my prayer to you forlorn, unheeded. وَلَمْ تَكُنْ بِدُعَائِكَ رَبِّي شَقِيًّا. Never have I found my prayer to you unheeded. And that's not because what he was asking for, an heir at the time, just was given to him immediately. No. But rather the ability to cope with the adversity was how he interpreted the response to his prayers. And this is quite important because the ability to look wider, to reframe in psychotherapeutic terms, and to see our difficulties in a broader context can change our experience of them. It may not change the events, but it can change our experience of those events. And this is a common theme that we have seen throughout our preceding 6 discussions when we looked at goal setting and intention, niyyah to begin with, and planning for success. Secondly, when we're looking at resilience, again, resilience has a big part of how we are able to change our perspective and choose our perspective of what is happening around us and to us. And then thirdly, when we were looking at mindfulness practice, that presence of mind in the here and the now allows us to break the ruminations of anxiety about the future or concerns about what may have happened in the past. And gratitude practice, we saw as the 4th technique, shukr, really allows us to focus on the positive, to find that silver lining in the cloud, even if it's simply the ability to breathe through the challenges, even if we can find nothing else to be positive about. And then we were considering how important it is to be able to maintain a positive mental attitude, even in the midst of great adversity. And we saw amazing examples from Imam Hussein alayhi salam, from the morning of the day of Ashura, how he was able to do that rooted in tawakkul, and how that then helps our relationship building, not just our relationship with ourselves and the self-esteem that we're able to generate through such thinking, but secondly also our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and thirdly, through the first 2, then our relationships with other people, and indeed having the courage and the confidence to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, to have the confidence to be humble, which is what relationships require. They require that interpersonal humility so that each person can feel respected and valued in that encounter, so that that relationship can become reciprocally rejuvenative and supportive. Tonight, therefore, we try and bring all of these 6 themes to bear on the specific issue of anxiety. Now, when we turn to the scientific literature, there's actually, of course, a lot written about anxiety, both from a psychological perspective as well as from a neuroscience view. But if we focus our discussions just on religion and anxiety, and even that subtopic has a massive amount of literature, there's been remarkable progress made at Duke Medical School in the US, looking at religion and spirituality and the impact upon mental health and indeed also physical health. And in one paper that reviewed over 3,000 published papers looking at religion and health broadly, as well as specific aspects of mental health, the overall findings were that there is an incredibly positive relationship between religion and spirituality on the one hand and mental health on the other. There is a supportive relationship there, an adaptive relationship that helps us maintain good mental health and recover from episodes of poor mental health. But when it comes to the specific issue of anxiety, it's more difficult to analyze. When we're thinking about depression, suicidality, substance abuse, the data is very clear about just how supportive religion and spirituality is. But when it comes to anxiety, there are different mechanisms of action here. And it can be very much a two-way street, because on the one hand, religion may reduce anxiety because of the support structures that it offers us and coping mechanisms that it provides. But on the other hand, we have to be fair in our analysis and also acknowledge that in some cases, religion can exacerbate anxiety and can cause anxiety when people become overly concerned about the effects of sin and punishment and judgment and the whole notion of damnation. And this is why I think it's really important that we never lose sight of scripture. Because in the Islamic tradition, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala introduces himself over 100 times in the Holy Quran as Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, as the most compassionate, the most benevolent. Such that whatever we may see in the Sharia, in the divine law, or fiqh in terms of jurisprudence and our legal understanding of the Sharia, regardless of all our understandings of the different sins and the consequences of them, they are all circumscribed within the parameters of Allah's all-encompassing rahmah. And we see it in the teachings, where he has declared sabakat rahmati la ghadab, that he has enjoined upon himself that his rahmah should transcend his sense of justice. So that even if we feel that through our negative actions, through sin, we may be deserving of punishment, we always have the ability to recognize that Allah's mercy is far greater than what we may deserve as his judgment, but rather we can hope very much to benefit from his benevolence, because that's how he introduces himself. The problem is that we tend to forget that. And that reminding of ourselves is important. Let us never forget that one of the key definitions of the word dhikr that refers to Islamic mindfulness practice is to remember. And often the name Ar-Rahman is used in dhikr practice. And again, let's reiterate that Rahmah is different to the name of Allah of Rahim. Rahman relates to the all-encompassing mercy that is available to everyone and everything. It's not about qualifying for it, and that's the key point. We are recipients of Allah's rahmah, not because of anything we may have done to achieve it or to deserve it, but rather it's just a manifestation of Allah's grace as his generosity and benevolence. So it's about him, not about us. Now that shifting of emphasis away from our own ego and towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is incredibly powerful in terms of mitigating the anxiety-generating effects of religion. So there is this risk, and the religion has provided mechanisms to counter that. Of course, we also see in the teachings of Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam, whereby he warns against obsessive compulsive behaviors in relation to religion. There was a case of somebody going to him and saying that his friend is forever performing ablution repeatedly because he's worried he's done it wrong and so his prayers will not be accepted. And Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam says to this man, why is your friend worshipping shaitan? And this man says, no, he's not worshipping shaitan. He is actually trying to be diligent. He's trying to be good. And that's why he wants to be really sure that he's not making a mistake. And the Imam says, no. Ask him, when he feels that sense of having to redo things repeatedly, what is the voice that he's listening to? Where does that voice come from? And when this man went and asked his friend reflected upon it. And in that metacognition, in that thinking about his own thinking, in that awakening, that reflection upon oneself, as we saw a few nights ago from Surah Al-Rum, we said, أَوَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ. Do they not reflect upon themselves? When this man reflected upon himself, he realized that a lot of that thinking actually comes from waswasa, from those whisperings of negativity. What we may in some cases call rumination, but theologically waswasa has many other dimensions. Regardless, when we look at the scientific evidence, we see that yes, there are risks of religion causing anxiety, but they are very few. So let's turn to the actual studies themselves. When we look at the clinical trials that have been done and reviewed, there were at least about 299 studies, clinical studies that were done, of which about half of them found an inverse association between religion and spirituality on the one hand and anxiety on the other. Inverse meaning that as the orientation towards religion and spirituality increased, the experience of anxiety decreased. So it was a helpful relationship. But about 11% of studies found that there was greater anxiety the more orthodox and religious a person became. And that's why it's really important that in the Islamic teachings, there are important sets of support structures that mitigate the risk of obsessive behaviors, of compulsive behaviors, of this over concern about soteriology, concern about salvation and damnation, and a recognition that all we need to do is the best we can. And then we leave the rest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is quite important, because when we look at the history of Karbala, a person named Hur, whose history we looked at in a different context earlier in our discussions, was a commander in the army of Yazid, and he was deeply anxious about his spiritual salvation, or indeed damnation, because he was the one who was responsible for bringing Imam Hussein al-Islam to Karbala. And when he was hearing the calls of al-atash, the piercing thirst from the young children of Imam Hussein al-Islam, history narrates, for example, the Maqtal of Mukarram, the historical account of Karbala from Al-Mukarram, how the soldiers around Hur, who knew him to be a valiant warrior, were surprised to see him so anxious. And he was saying, why would I not be anxious? I see myself walking between heaven and hell. How can I go to war with the grandson of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him? And he crossed sides, and he went to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, weeping about what would happen to him and begging for forgiveness. And what was the response of the Imam alayhi salam? He embraced him. He said, no, that not only have I forgiven you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven you. And this is really important, because whatever sins we may have committed, in the overall spectrum, it doesn't necessarily compare to what Hur did. We are not instrumental in the calamity of the events of Karbala. Hur was, and he recognized that. The critical point was that upon recognizing that, he sought forgiveness. And the Islamic teachings are absolutely clear that when we seek forgiveness, we can be confident of redemption. Not because of the greatness of our process of istighfar, the process of seeking forgiveness. No. But because of the greatness of the magnanimity of the one to whom we're seeking, the one from whom we're seeking forgiveness. And that's the critical point that the history of Hur teaches us, that salvation is always available, regardless of what we have done. And there is a warning here that we must not fall into the trap of elevating our errors, our mistakes, our sins to a level that's above the compassion and mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because often our waswasa, shaitan's whisperings, make us believe that we're capable of committing such great sins that we no longer qualify for Allah's mercy. Now yes, the teachings do say that if we commit shirk, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not forgive that sin of ascribing partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, alhamdulillah, that's not a sin we fall into. We work within the parameters of La ilaha illallah, that there is no God but Allah. So within those parameters, the sins that we commit, whether they're gunah kabira or sagira, whether they're the greatest sins or the relatively minor sins, the road to salvation is never closed. And that's an important point that Hur teaches us. And as he was passing away, Imam Hussein alayhi salam declared as he was cradling him, he said, your mother named you correctly, for you are truly free both in this world and in the hereafter. You are Hur, Hur of course meaning free. And we can be Hur too. And all too often, when we disregard that potential that we have, we can become entrapped in the maintenance cycles of anxiety. And it's really important to break those maintenance cycles by recognizing that we can be free and we can choose a path that's different to the one we have been walking thus far. When we look at the history of Imam Hussein himself, what we see is that there are many tools that he has provided us for mitigating and countering the effects of anxiety. And I'd like to compartmentalize them into three groups. One is cognitive, the second is about emotion, so affect, and the third is behavioral, things that we can do, actions. So firstly, in terms of cognitive, thinking, what are the thinking skills he taught us? Well, firstly, the importance of positive thinking. We saw from the time he left Medina, he was planning for success. But success did not necessarily mean an easy path. He was always clear that his mission was about sacrifice. But he was positive that he would be successful in his objective of Islah fi ummati jaddi, of the reform, the reformation and transformation of the community of his grandfather. That's important because he showed consistently how he was able to maintain positive thinking throughout his journey, from the time he left Medina all the way to the day of Ashura itself. And we've considered various examples of how he has used his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from an emotional point of view to draw upon the strength that he always had access to by turning to his beloved Lord. And it also is a teaching for us that we need to cultivate a strong relationship of trust with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in good times, so that when we fall into difficult times, we can draw upon that relationship. So firstly, positive thinking. Secondly, the second cognitive tool that we gain from him is his philosophy. So his metaphysics, in particular, in that letter that he wrote to Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, his half-brother in Medina, in the letter that we discussed a few nights ago, where he was saying, "Ad-dunya lam takun wal akhirah lam tazul," that the world has no essential permanence. It is not, if we translate it literally. The world does not have a substantive reality that of its own. It is transient and ephemeral. Yet, the hereafter, wal akhirah lam tazul, is unceasing. It's beginningless and endless time. It is outside of time and space. So his metaphysical perspective freed him from the vicissitudes of this realm, so that whilst he took them seriously, of course he did, he was not bound by them in terms of his well-being. His well-being was not anchored to the events of this world. His well-being was already anchored in the realm that was beyond time and space. And if we can elevate our philosophical understanding of ourselves and the world around us to that level, that's a really powerful cognitive position to be in. Not just to counter the effects of anxiety, but to establish the platform for human flourishing, so that the human soul can be elevated to the state of nafsul mutma'inna, as we discussed in our first discussion. That soul that is at perfect harmony. The third cognitive tool that we see from his history in Karbala is that he never gave way to automatic negative thoughts, ants, so to speak. And we see that this recognition and awareness of automatic negative thinking is a fundamental component of psychotherapeutic tools such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or many other forms of cognitive therapy. Being aware of our thinking patterns, particularly the negative thinking patterns, how and when they're triggered. For many people, when they have an overwhelming enemy approaching them, there are often negative thoughts that are triggered about our demise, about the futility of whatever actions we can undertake, how we are forlorn and there's no point carrying on, how we are doomed to being vanquished. And yet, we see none of that from Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Even though he wept in advance for what was to come. It is narrated that when they reached Karbala, he gathered his family and friends and he wept about the state of the world and how a sacrifice would be required. He was a loving imam at the end of the day. But that did not in any way result in him succumbing to negative thinking, particularly never automatic negative thinking. And when we look at ourselves, we often find that we are vulnerable to having triggers that prompt negative thinking about different aspects of our lives. And partly the challenge is to become aware of what are the aspects of our lives that we are susceptible to having automatic negative thinking in. For some people, it could be something intellectual. They might be, for example, struggling in maths. And whenever something mathematical comes up, we think, oh no, I can't possibly do that. Or it could be something spiritual. Whenever the notion of, Fajr Salah, the early morning prayer comes up, the thought might arise, oh, I can't possibly wake up in time. Well, that's an automatic negative thought. We can challenge it. We can counter it. And one of the ways we can counter it is through action. What in psychotherapy is often referred to as behavioral activation. To activate ourselves so that we can prove to ourselves that that thinking pattern is incorrect. We can replace the ants, the automatic negative thoughts, with maths, with more accurate thoughts. And we see from the history of Imam Hussein alayhi salam that he never allowed these automatic negative thoughts to creep in, even though there was so much negativity going on around him. So this three-pronged approach, firstly, positive thinking, secondly, an illuminated philosophy, enlightened philosophy, and thirdly, this caution about never giving way to ants, to automatic negative thoughts. So that's the first dimension in countering anxiety, the cognitive dimension. Secondly, when we turn to the emotional dimension of countering anxiety, we see a number of techniques, but I'd like to focus on just two in the interest of time. The first is dua, psalms. Now, of course, in the Islamic tradition, we have a rich collection of prescribed psalms. For instance, in the Sayfa Sajjadiyya, perhaps the oldest extant collection of Islamic psalms attributed to the illustrious son of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, who was given the title Zainul Abidin, the jewel, the pinnacle of the worshippers. And in this text, we have psalms for all kinds of human concerns, spanning health, finance, looking after children, whatever it might be, it's covered, including, of course, spiritual challenges. Psalms are something we see Imam Hussein alayhi salam turning to repeatedly. When he had time, we see him reciting beautiful long psalms. For instance, the Dua of Arafah, attributed to Imam Hussein alayhi salam, is a beautiful psalm that talks about the role of divinity in our lives, right from our very inception through to our return back to him. How at every step of the way he cradles us. And we see that philosophy of seeing Allah not as a despotic judge, astaghfirullah, but rather as the loving, nourishing, nurturing God who is always there to support us, never leaving us alone. And when we look at the Psalms that he just compiled, impromptu, extempo he delivered, and we've received these through the auspices of Imam Sajjad, for instance, alayhi salam, we see the beauty of the Psalms. And when you analyze the linguistic structure of these Psalms, you see an important pattern. Firstly, recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for who He is. Secondly, acknowledging ourselves in who we are, in a really down-to-earth way, pragmatic. And then thirdly, recognizing how we may be elevated through Allah's grace, so that regardless of where we may find ourselves, our destiny is to be elevated to a state of tranquility in the divine embrace. That's not to say that we don't experience difficulties, far from it. But rather, it's about our ability to separate the negative events in our lives with our positive experience of them. And that's a skill that requires incredible emotional and spiritual maturity. And that's what we see in this use of Psalms as an emotional tool to manage events that would otherwise cause anxiety. Secondly, the Imam alayhi salam uses relationships very skillfully. Not just the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I'm talking about relationships with people around him. We saw yesterday in our discussions how he wrote a letter to his beloved fair friend Habib ibn Madahir. And we saw how, it wasn't about, the military strength of this elderly gentleman. It wasn't about that. But it was about showing the importance of making ourselves vulnerable and open to relationships, to join hands with other people, but to do so not in a compelling way, but in an open, loving way through the principle of free will. That's critical, because we see in the history books that on the night of Ashura, the Imam alayhi salam blew out the candle and he was said that I free you from the obligations of bay'ah. I free you from your duty to me with the oath of allegiance you gave me. I release you from it. That was his compassion. Use the darkness of the night to save yourselves, to go far from this place. And yet, so many companions remained. And his response was to call out in acknowledgement, saying that neither his father, nor his brother, nor his grandfather had companions who were as faithful as the companions that he had. The relationship that he acknowledged with his companions was inspiring. And we learn from that when we are on the cusp of a really important challenge, the night before something fateful is about to happen, we too should draw close to us the people who we trust, the people who we can count on to support us. Not necessarily because we need that support. The Imam alayhi salam did not need the support of anyone. We saw on the late afternoon of Ashura just how much self-agency he had, agency in a psychological sense, of the ability to act on one's own strength to determine the outcome of one's own life. He had incredible strength. He didn't need the support of relationships, but he was teaching us that it's incredibly helpful to draw upon others around us, that no person is an island, and that to think like that is actually a form of arrogance. He humbled himself to call for help, even from an elderly person like Habib. And that emotional strength is something that we can learn from as a tool to manage our episodes of anxiety. Indeed, when we look at the scientific evidence, we see that one of the maintenance cycles, one of the aspects of the maintenance cycle of anxiety is loneliness. And one of the ways to break it is through relationship. To have supportive, nurturing relationships is an important way of breaking free from the cycles of anxiety that keep us shackled within anxious episodes, but to move from them into the freedom of a state of equanimity, a state of mutmainna. The third aspect, so building on cognitive, emotional, and thirdly, behavioral, looking at actions. Because of course, the Imam alayhi salam was a man of action. He was a leader. And we see at Dhu Husn, the place where he met the army of Hur head on. We see from the Maqtal literature that shortly after leaving Sharaf, his scouts noticed something on the horizon, and that was identified as the heads of spears of an oncoming army. And the Imam alayhi salam's immediate reaction was to ask the local guides for where is the high ground, a mountainous area, such that the mountain could be behind them so that they could not be outflanked and they could meet the enemy head on. Doing what we can, doing the best we can in whatever circumstances we are in, is a very important lesson. the opposite to learned helplessness. Learned helplessness, as we saw in previous discussions, is one of the features of depression, one of the features of what we see happening when people are locked in depressive episodes. Such that even if there are things they can do, they don't think to do them. It doesn't occur to them to take those actions. And yet Imam Hussein alayhi salam was showing behavioral activation at the highest level. He did not allow the prospect of an oncoming battalion to cause him to freeze. Quite the opposite. It galvanized him into action. And he thought clearly and strategically. So what he did at Dhu Husn is quite an important metaphor for our lives. What is the Dhu Husn in our lives? With the challenges that we're facing, what is the high ground that we can seek to be able to confront that challenge from a position of strength rather than from a position of weakness? And partly the exercise is to look, is there any high ground around us? Is there any source of strength that we can harness? The second example of behavioral strength that we see is what he did on the late afternoon of the day of Ashura. The journalists, particularly from the side of Yazid's army, narrate that they were surprised at how powerfully Imam Hussein alayhi salam was able to fight, even though all his companions and family members had been martyred. That shows an incredible strength to be active in the greatest challenge, physical battle, after having lost all these people close to you, having experienced bereavement after bereavement, yet having the strength to stand and fight for what we believe in. Never allowing himself to succumb to becoming anxious, but rather to use the strength that he has to continue to fight. But let's not be misunderstood. This is not to say that people who are experiencing anxiety are weak. No, quite the opposite. This is to say that the Imam alayhi salam was at an entirely different level. The Imam alayhi salam was the Imam. In the Shia tradition, we attribute perfection to the Imam alayhi salam. And so we learn from his lessons to be able to cope with when we do experience anxiety. Because we do not have the strength of Imamah, we do experience this as a natural part of being an ordinary believer. It's not a mark of poor faith. Rather, it is an opportunity to draw upon our faith, to be able to cope with the adversity. And we have all of these examples, cognitive examples, thinking positively, having tawakkul, having an enlightened metaphysics, looking deeply at the nature of reality. Thirdly, not succumbing to negative thinking, automatic negative thoughts. That's the cognitive. Turning to the emotional, just to recap, drawing upon and building a good relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have that strength of tawakkul, of trust in Allah. Secondly, having good relationships with people around us, particularly other believers who can support us in our spiritual journey. And thirdly, in terms of the behavioral side, to take action where we can, to do what is within our power, to find the high ground, to find the Dhu Husn. And when we apply these in our lives, we primarily need to recognize that we are not alone. We saw in the dua that the Imam alayhi salam recited early on the day of Ashura that he is never alone. The word he uses is bika, with you. I have experienced all of this with you. And so you relieved me of the pain of the difficulty that I'm facing. So that we are never subject to feeling the desolation of isolation, of being lonely. So we're never alone, we always have help available in the form of divine support. Secondly, we can use Psalms, dua, for psychological reframing, for zooming out, for putting that difficulty into a wider context, and to recognize the limitations of what is making us anxious, that it applies within a specific narrow context of our lives. It cannot affect all aspects of our physical, spiritual lives. And thirdly, that we can be empowered. We can counter this learned form of helplessness that we see so often manifesting in mental health challenges. And we can be activated to become agents in our own destiny, as the spirit of being Azadars galvanizes our courage, our fortitude, and our confidence. Tonight, we remember a very young man who had all of these attributes. The son of Imam Hassan alayhi salam, Qasim. And it is really quite important that we see in the history of Hazrat Qasim that even though he was young, narrated to be only about 13 years old, yet when he went to battle, having been allowed to go into battle by Imam Hussein alayhi salam because of the letter he had from his father Imam Hassan alayhi salam, pleading with Imam Hussein alayhi salam to allow Qasim to go forward as his representative on the day of Ashura. We see that the enemy, being shocked at the beauty of this young man, who they've described as being like the moon, and people asking, who is he? And when they are told that he is the grandson of Ali ibn Abi Talib, becoming so overcome with hatred, wanting to murder him, they try and take him on in single combat, but they fail. And so they attack him on all sides. And it is narrated that a mace is struck upon his head as he falls to the ground, and he calls upon his uncle for help. The Imam al-Islam cuts through the ranks of all these cowardly mercenaries such that they're scattered, and the hooves of their horses trample upon the body of Hazrat Qasim. When the Imam al-Islam reaches him, he has to collect the pieces of his body in his amama, like one gathers flowers from a garden. Allah la'natullahi ala zalimeen, wa say'alamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalabin yanqalibun, inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Let us pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us the strength to live the teachings of the history of Karbala, and to forgive us and our parents and teachers and ancestors who have passed away, and to keep us faithful to the Imam of our time. Surah Al-Mubarak Al-Fatiha.